Welcome back to the shop and to the channel. Well, we're getting into the short rows here in the disassembly of the South Bend lathe. The last major component here is the quick change gearbox. I'm going to flip this thing over on its face so I can start removing all of the gears. I want to get this lead screw off of here first. There's a big nut, a big lock nut that's holding the back of the lead screw onto this gear. And I find the easiest way to do something like this is to put a wrench on it and just whack it, and that's enough to loosen it without having to resort to things that might do damage to some of these components. Well, that loosened it, but not quite enough. So I've got this thin piece of plywood here I'm going to wedge into the gears so that I can use a wrench on that lock nut and get it removed. I'll use my trusty brass drift here to knock the lead screw out of the end of the casting. There's a bearing there as well as this gear. Well, with that lead screw off, I can remove this outer bearing. I've never seen a bearing constructed quite like this. I'm sure it's some type of a thrust bearing, but I'll have to show a close-up of this when I go to reassemble the gearbox. And this lead screw gear is loose, so we'll put that to the side. This bearing that's still in the casting can't come out until the cone gears are removed. I think next we'll go ahead and get the tumblers removed. Before I can take the tumblers off, I have to remove this guide bar that's attached to the bottom here with a couple of screws and some pins. On one end of the tumbler shaft, there's a pin that holds it into one end of the casting. I'll just use a punch and drive that out. With that pin removed, I can use a hammer and the brass drift here to drive that tumbler shaft all the way through the other end, and this will release the tumblers. On the end of the tumbler is this wide drive gear, and that is key to the shaft we just removed. And this large idler gear is held into the tumbler with a pin. Each of the idler gears have this needle bearing in the center, and these look like they're in really good condition. I think I'm just going to leave them as is. I'm going to take the handles off of this later once I get them cleaned up. Next, I want to get these cone gears removed. There's a pin that's holding this 16-tooth gear onto the shaft, and I'm going to punch this out with a punch, and it drove out a little bit further than I expected. It's driven out so far now that I can't rotate the gear or the shaft.
Really?
Because the pin is hitting the other side of the casting. Now I got to figure out how to push it back in at least just a little bit so I can turn it around. You know, it might be that that pin is through it enough that it's not holding the gear onto the shaft. And it feels like I can push that shaft. I think I can push that shaft all the way through these gears now. Well, this first clump of gears here is actually pinned together loosely. I think I want to keep them oriented this way so when they go back together, they go back the same way. I'm sure there's wear on the teeth that's, you know, in a certain way, and if I were to switch these up, it might end up making some noise. Well, on the other end of that shaft, there's a couple of compound gears and then a smaller gear. And again, I want to keep these together in the orientation that they came out. So I'm going to zip tie them together like this, and they'll stay together like this until they go back in. Well, the main drive shaft here is held in place on one end with a collar that is pinned to the shaft. With that collar off, it's pretty easy to tap it out the rest of the way with the brass punch. And then there's a couple of other compound gears that are on the drive shaft. And again, I'm going to keep these together with a zip tie. Well, with all that out now, I can pop out this bearing for the lead screw. This came out a lot easier than I would have expected. I would expect it to be a press fit. The bearing feels really good and sounds good, so I think it's just going to need to be cleaned up. And then I'll probably use some bearing retainer compound when I go to reinstall it. Well, I did take a closer look at all of these bushings, and they all look like they're in really good shape. They're all pretty tight, and I think they're going to be fine. The only one that is suspect might be the bushings for the tumbler shaft. I'm going to have to think about that, whether or not it's enough of an issue that warrants going through the effort of pushing those out and making new ones. Well, I'm going to replace these oil cups, so I don't care how they come out. So I'm going to just try a wrench here and see if I can't twist it out. It was busted off a little harder than I thought it was going to. They busted off flush to the casting, so we'll have to work on that a little bit later. I'm going to have to think about how I want to resolve that. Well, in the meantime, I'm going to take off this thread feed chart. I'm not going to save it. I've got another one that's in much better condition, so I'm just going to rip it off. It's not worth trying to salvage at this point. It's just too far gone. Well, the drive screws didn't want to come out with it, so I'll work on getting those out with some various tools. They usually come out fairly easy. I've only had one occasion where I couldn't get a drive screw out, and I ended up having to drill it out with a carbide burr, and that ultimately got it out, but it was a lot more work than I anticipated. Well, back to these oil cups, and sorry for the bad camera angle. My other camera died, so I don't have video from the other side. But basically, I put an easy out in the drill driver here and used it to spin those oil cups out of the holes in the casting. And of course, the color under that thread and feed chart is going to be the original color of this lathe, and that's the color I intend to repaint it. Well, part of the cleaning process is going to entail me cleaning out all of the oil galleries in the casting. Well, the main oil gallery that those two oil cups feed is drilled straight through horizontally in the casting, and in each end there's a small plug that's put in place, obviously to keep the oil from leaking out. So on either end there's a couple of plugs here, and in order to get to that entire gallery I need to drill those plugs out, and that'll let me clean all of this out. I have a Scotch-Brite pad on the end of my die grinder here. I'm trying to smooth out the face of that plug, just so that when I use the center punch I can make sure I get it right in the middle. I'll just drill a small hole now in the center of it, and this thing was a lot thinner than I was expecting it to be, so I think the easiest way to get this out will be to use that easy out I used on the oil cups. I'll do the same thing here on the other side. When I go to reassemble this, I'm going to use some grub screws to plug these holes. So I'm just using the tap size drill here so I can tap these holes for the right size grub screw. I'll clear off a little bit more of the paint here on the side so that I can use a tap guide to help me make sure that I'm going in straight. The last thing I want to do is break off a tap inside this thing. And I'll just, again, do the same thing here on the other side. Well, with these tumblers now cleaned up, I want to work on removing these handles from them, just to make sure that I get these good and cleaned and it doesn't interfere with me painting the rest of it. Well, there's only 4 components here to this, and one of them is this outer shell. Then there's the center shaft, there's a spring, and then there's a pin that pins that outer shell to the center shaft. Now that pin, which I suspect might be a taper pin, has been blended into that outer shell, and it is very, very difficult to see. Well, So as long as I can find the small end of the taper pin, and these are pretty small taper pins, so it's easy to mix up which end is which. Again, assuming it's a taper pin. I should be able to drive it out. And these are in here pretty sturdily, so it's taking quite a bit of effort to knock it through. With that pin removed here, I'm kind of holding the tumbler with a pair of vice grips. I've got the knurl sort of cover in one hand, and I'm using a brass punch to try to drive the plunger through the cover, or the cover over the plunger. Now the plunger then should fall through the rest of the tumbler, but I suspect there's probably some kind of a burr on it, and I'll just use the brass punch here to pop it the rest of the way through. And then we can take the spring off, and this looks pretty good, but it does need to be cleaned. Well, off camera, I went through and cleaned up all these oil galleries. There was gunk down here where the oil cups were, and then the main gallery that goes all the way through from one end to the other. There were some chunks of something in there. I think there were a few chips in there too. With it upside down here, you can see the hole that's drilled into that main oil gallery that feeds oil to the output lead screw shaft. And then there's this hole here that lubricates one end of the cone gear shaft. Well, if I rotate this thing around here, you can see the oil gallery that's drilled between the cone gear shaft and one end here of the tumbler shaft. On the opposite end of the tumbler shaft, there's a gallery that's drilled between it and the other side of the cone gear shaft, and that's what feeds this end of the tumbler shaft. And then on this end, you can see the hole that's drilled into the main gallery that feeds oil to this side of the cone gear, and then also a hole that is feeding oil to this side of the main drive shaft. And then the other side of the drive shaft, this hole here is what feeds oil onto it. There was a recent discussion on one of the Facebook pages about whether or not South Bend might have used lead paint in any of their machines. Well, that got me a little bit curious myself, so I went on to the Amazons and I bought this, little lead test kit. I think it was like $5 or $10. Well, I've got some of the original paint exposed, so why not try it there? The instructions say get the tip of it a little bit wet and then just rub in an area for about 30 seconds. Now this lathe is from 1960, but I really doubt that there's any lead in this paint. I do wear a respirator whenever I'm wire wheeling or stripping paint off of these things, so I'm not really overly concerned about it, but it got me curious, and why not? Let's just find out. Well, there's no discernible color change here on the end of the swab, so I think it is safe to say that there is no lead in this original paint. Well, I'll try to hear also on the paint that was used to repaint this thing, since that's most of what seems to be coming off of it. And again, there is no discernible color change, so there is no lead in this paint either. Well, and just to be sure I know what I'm supposed to be looking for here, I grabbed a lead sinker out of my tackle box, and I'm just rubbing another swab on it, and you can see here how it changes to a nice reddish magenta purple color, and I saw none of that when I was using these on the other two paint spots. Well, that's it for the teardown on the quick change gearbox. Now I've got to get this stripped of all of its paint, get all the internals cleaned up, and start the process of repainting it. But I'm not going to bore you with that. Well, if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, subscribe if you're not a subscriber. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.